Hi, everybody. It's Mrs. Caruso, and this is week 4 called What Was Jamestown Like? So, this week in class, we learned a little bit more about what this first permanent English colony was like. But you remember we did a little bit of review before we got there. I wanted to take you back through Odyssey of Faith that you've been reading. So, we're going to do that together right now. Let me make myself small. There we are. Okay, put me over here in the corner, out of the way a little bit. Okay, so we started off actually by looking at the map that we had done together last week. We looked at the continent of Europe where Reformation was breaking out, reform of the church. You remember we talked about that, that in certain nations there was more purifying of the church than there were in other places. So we reviewed all of that. And we looked at my rather messy map, right? I didn't color in the lines too well because I had to do it with the computer, and I'm not very good at it. So we looked over here at the Italian peninsula and saw there where the headquarters of the Roman Church were located, that all across the Italian peninsula there was very little reform. And also in this country here, which you all identified as Spain, very little reform, almost none. And we also talked about in that country that there was a very powerful king. His name was Philip II. Then we looked in the middle here at France and the German states and Switzerland, and we saw they were orange, and that represented some reform. And that it was a little different in France. It wasn't that there were pockets of reform, it was that there were large portions of the country that were fighting against one another. And you guys, I haven't introduced this term yet in class, but this is when we really developed what was called the Protestants. You've heard that term. They were protesting, but the other group of Christians were called Catholics. So Protestants and Catholics were fighting against one another in France. And this is where the most lives were lost, was in France, because there were very powerful Protestant armies and very powerful Catholic armies that were led by the kings of France. And they fought a lot, and neighbors even rose up against their neighbors to kill. Catholic neighbors rose up against Protestant neighbors and put them to death. So that's what was happening in France. In the German states and in Switzerland, it was more, we color it orange because there were little red pockets and little white pockets kind of all over these places. So overall, there was some reform. There were some places where you would be punished or put in jail or killed because you were a Protestant or a reformer. But in other places, it was celebrated, and a whole area, almost like a whole state would be a Protestant state. So we had a mixed bag in the German states and in Switzerland. But then we noticed there was one nation on our map of Europe that really did have a purified church, where these changes and reforms took hold in a different way, where a whole nation separated itself from the Roman church down here, right? And that nation was up here, this island, England. And then we reminded you that by this time, England had a young queen, and how unusual that was. So they had Queen Elizabeth on the throne, and how young she was, and that her enemy was this man down here, King Philip II of Spain. Why? Why was it such a problem? Well, because he believed that with all of his power and all of his wealth and all of his armies, that his job was to bring all of the other nations back under the authority of the Roman Church, that they all should obey what the Pope and the church leaders said, even though it was not sola scriptura, right? And we talked in class, I told you a little story that wasn't really part of my lesson plan, but I'll remind you of what I said. That when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, when she became the queen, it was a miracle. That is a whole other story, that she even became the queen. But the first thing that King Philip did to try to conquer England and make it come back under the Catholic faith was he proposed marriage. He said, I want to marry you. And what did she say? She said no. She realized that he really didn't love her. He just wanted to control England. Well, then King Philip decided that what he couldn't take by marriage, he would try to take by force. He would try to attack England and try to eliminate the queen so that he could bring them back, turn them red again, right? Make them loyal to the Catholic Church. And one other thing I mentioned to you about Elizabeth, I said, did she ever get married? She did not, because she very quickly realized that all of the men that were wanting to marry her, the kings and princes from other places across Europe, she did not trust them. She thought all of them were really trying to control England and its church. And so she made a promise to her people, and she said, I will be married to England. And so she became known as the Virgin Queen. So a virgin is a woman that never gets married, a Virgin Queen. And that's why later, remember, she will say yes to going to the New World. Well, you guys, when they claimed all of the land in North America, they named it after her. She was the Virgin Queen, so they called all of that land in North America, they called it Virginia. That's how Virginia got its name, Virgin, yeah, right? So Virginia is really named after Queen Elizabeth. All right, so first we kind of looked at that map and chatted about it, and then we started talking about a young man who was born in England and became an orphan when he was very young. An orphan means that his mom and his dad both died. And we looked at one of these pictures. In fact, let me make myself big again here to talk about this. There we go. And we looked at one of the pictures in Odyssey of Faith, this one, right? So that we could remind ourselves about the life of Richard Hakluyt. Richard Hakluyt. And I asked you, how we know that God prepares people for his special purpose. And I asked you, how did God get Richard Hakluyt ready? And we remembered that some of the things were hard things, right? Like the fact that he lost his parents meant that he went to live with his cousin. And that his cousin was the one who was going to introduce him to all of these ideas about the New World and the explorers of the New World. And that probably would not have happened if he had stayed living in his home with his parents. So even this hard thing, God means for good. And that's what he promises us in the Bible, that even the things that man means for evil, God means for good. Okay? For those that love him and are called according to his purpose. We know that Richard Hakluyt was, young Richard Hakluyt. So one of the things was that he was born in England. That was one of the ways God got him ready. If he had been born anywhere else, it would not have been the same result. But he was born in England during the time of great reform. So he learned to love the Bible as sola scriptura, the Bible alone. He also recognized the threat of Spain and realized he needed to defend England, help to keep her free. Then, of course, his uncle and his uncle's influence, showing him all those maps and globes and bringing him to the Bible to say to him that there are scriptures in the Bible that say that you'll see the mighty hand of God if you go out on the sea in a ship. And that just really inspired Richard Hakluyt, didn't it? It changed the vision that he had for his life. And that wasn't an accident. That was part of God preparing him. We know that he traveled all over Europe and he talked to the sea captains and he learned everything that they knew. That was part of God preparing young Richard Hakluyt. And then he went to work for the Queen. And when he was working for the Queen, he really learned very quickly how dangerous King Philip was to England, and that King Philip wanted to destroy England and take it for himself. He also observed what was happening in France, and that these poor reformers were being killed simply for wanting to believe what was in the pages of the Bible and worship according to what they saw there. So we know that at that point, we can say, was he just lucky that he was born in England and had a Bible and had an uncle who taught him about the New World and that he got a job working for the Queen? And of course, no, it's not luck. It's not coincidence. It is God's providence. God cares for and is in control of all of his creation, even the life of young Richard Hakluyt. He was getting him ready for a special purpose. So we know then that the Richard Hakluyt was able to get an appointment with the Queen. He realizes at this point, we have a problem, and he has what he believes is the solution. He knows about the New World, and he has a meeting with the Queen, and he asks her to give permission to go to the New World, but he gives 3 big reasons that he thinks we need to go. Let me get small. There we go. King Philip is one of the reasons, but let's move on. He says we need to go over to the New World, which was North America and South America. And remember what was happening, you guys. All of South America had become red. It had become red because Spain had been given permission by the Pope to come over and colonize in the New World. None of the other countries were allowed to go. There was a special document that was signed, a special treaty, and none of the other countries went until Richard Hakluyt had that meeting with the Queen and convinced her that she needed to break the rules. She needed to go. He said, number 1, England needs to bring the pure truth of the Bible to the New World because the people there, they worship false gods. And the faith, the church that King Philip is planting there is not teaching them the truth about God's word. We need to go and share the truth, he said to her. Then number 2, he said, England needs to make a safe place where all reformers, even from France or from the German states, a place where they can escape if they're being punished or killed for reading or believing the Bible. And then he said the third thing that was important, of course, was we need to keep Spain and King Philip II from taking over everything, because if they do, they're going to use it to destroy everybody that resists them, including us in England. So those were his 3 big reasons. And then we discussed, let me bring myself back here, that what did Queen Elizabeth say? Yes, she said yes. But that first settlement, when they got over there and they started their settlement, it failed. And part of the reason it failed was they could not send help. They could not send ships back to bring extra supplies that the people needed. And they couldn't send ships because England, the country of England, was being attacked by King Philip II and his mighty navy called the Spanish Armada. And so those first English settlers that were planted at Roanoke were stranded there. And you remember last week I told you we lost them. We really don't know what happened to that settlement, but it disappeared. So no English settlement still in the New World. And then good Queen Elizabeth died, and we got a new king on the throne. Remember, she had no children. So she had to find the closest relative that was a Protestant. And it was this man, King James, and he was in Scotland, which is part of that island, right? He was already king in Scotland, and they invited him to also become king of England. And of course he said yes. Well, now this meant that Richard Hakluyt, who had to persevere, he had to just keep pressing on. He had gotten the yes finally from Queen Elizabeth, and then it didn't work. They had persevered through the attack of the Spanish Armada, and they had survived by God's grace. And now he would have to convince another English monarch to say yes. He went back to King James. He gave him all of his reasons, and King James said yes. Then you read in your book that King James made a deal with them. We call that deal a charter. And here is the picture right here of the charter, the Virginia Charter that he signed in 1606, where he gives them permission to go to the New World. He says yes, but he says, I'm going to send some things with you. Number 1, you're going to take the Church of England, and I want you to take sola scriptura, God's word. So that is going with you. And he made very clear in those very first lines, you can have your parents read it to you, that the reason they were going, the first reason they list, was so that they could plant the gospel. That's the good news about Jesus. That's what the gospel is. They were going to plant the gospel in a place where people did not know the truth and they were in darkness. That's what it says in that charter. Isn't that something? But another thing that's in the charter that I don't think, nope, it's not in your book. They didn't put that part in. But the other thing that he sent with them was English law. He said, you're going to bring English law with you so that you guys have the same law there that you have here. All the same list of protections, remember? People can't steal, the king has to obey the law, all those ideas are going to go with you. And that's called Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta law went with them to the New World. You guys remember that's really different than the law they have in Spain. That was called Roman law. So that's they had Roman law all across Europe. But now this Magna Carta law that came from King Alfred's law, that came from the Bible. Biblical law was going to get planted in North America for the first time. All because King James said yes. Okay. So now money was raised and men were recruited to go on this trip. Do you remember how many men went on the trip? Boarded these ships to go to the New World? More than 100, right? More than 100 men would come and settle. Men and a few boys, but mostly grown-up men. And how many ships did they have? They had 3, right? Do you remember their names? I'll give you a second to think. The biggest one, let's see, here she is right here. This biggest one was called the Susan Constant. Yes, and then the middle-sized one right here, that one's called the Godspeed. And the smallest one here in the middle, that ship was called the Discovery. Right? 3 ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, will leave in December of 1606 and head to the New World. But we had to cover a couple things. Did Richard Hakluyt go with them? He did not. He was too old by now to go, right? And so he sent his very good friend instead. His friend's name was Reverend Robert Hunt. Here was Reverend Hunt, right? So good Reverend Hunt will go with them instead of Richard Hakluyt. But before they leave, Richard Hakluyt and the other men in the Virginia Company, they were the ones who had raised the money and gotten the ships ready and recruited all the men. Well, they gave them a box, and inside the box were some special things. Inside the box was the law that they were to bring to the New World. And we remember that that law was Magna Carta. That's the law that they'd be bringing with them to the New World. And then inside the box, maybe not inside the box, but we can think of it that way. In our box when we traveled, a Bible, because they were bringing the truth of God's word to the New World. And then lastly, he put some instructions in there. So we put our instructions in the box and prepared for our trip. Now you remember we went outside to reenact the trip. But before we did, we remembered that they had a difficult journey. It was not an easy trip. In fact, Reverend Hunt had a terrible time. He was not used to being on the sea. He wasn't a sailor, and so he was very, very seasick. In fact, they thought he might die. And some of the men even wanted to throw him overboard, some of the sailors, not the other men who were going, but some of the sailors on the ship did not respond very well to Reverend Hunt. They thought he was like Jonah, and if we throw him overboard, that all the storms that they were encountering that were making him so sick, they said, maybe if we throw him overboard, we'll be better. Well, of course they did not. And one of the people who intervened, who saved Reverend Hunt, was Captain John Smith. We'll talk more about him in just a minute. After their long journey, 144 days, right, to get all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, you remember that they then encountered a storm, a terrible storm, and they could not find the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay where they needed to come in. They knew that's where they were headed. They wanted to come into the Chesapeake away from the coast and build their settlement there, but they couldn't find the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. So let me make myself small and get to our next slide. We went outside so that we could experience and reenact our journey. And the first thing that Mrs. Gyrus introduced to you all was this compass rose. You remember that was on the chalkboard? And we were reminded of our directions: north, south, east, and west. Okay? So we looked at that compass rose, and then we remembered the journey of those 3 ships as they, oh, actually, those look like Spanish ships, don't they? I think Mrs. Caruso put the wrong picture in. Those are not the English ships. Those are Spanish ships. How can we tell? Look at the flag that they're flying. I see a red X instead of a red cross. Yes. All right, here we are. So we head out. They left England in December of 1606. You guys, right here, they got stuck. This is where the storms were so terrible that they were considering throwing Reverend Hunt overboard. Well, a couple men wanted to throw him overboard. Finally, the storm subsided and they sailed, remember, just like you, to the south, to the south, to the south, to the south. So they're following the current, and so were you in the driveway. Do you remember the blue marks on the driveway as you followed the current to the south? There is a circle current that runs in the Atlantic Ocean. It goes around like a big swirl. And it's always easier for ships to get into the current and travel with it. It's like being in a river of water in the middle of the ocean. So you don't want to fight the current, you want to go with the current, and that's what they did. So they got in the current and sailed just like you did all the way to the south, and they turned towards the west and finally wound up in those little yellow dots on the driveway. Those were our islands. So they were finally into the islands, but we said they didn't stay in the islands. They got water, they picked up some more food as they traveled from island to island, and they rested after their long journey. And then they were ready to make the last part of the journey, where now they would head to the north, right? So they started to travel to the north, looking for that entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. When storms came up for 2 weeks, again, they found themselves in stormy conditions, and the sailors could not find the entrance to the Chesapeake. Finally, the storm got so terrifically bad that they had to take down all their sails and just drift through the night. I'm going to pause because I want to find real quick the words of Captain John Smith. We have somebody who was there on the ship who told us exactly what happened. All right, so these words might sound a little bit funny to you because they are written in Old English. They're written as they would have spoken at that time. So here's what Captain John Smith wrote. He said, "The company, the group of men, they were not just a little discomforted, seeing that the sailors had passed their reckoning, the place where they were supposed to go in, and found no land, so that Captain Ratcliffe desired to bear up the helm and return to England rather than make further search. But God." You guys, those are the 2 most important words. But God. But God, he said, the guider of all good actions, forcing them by an extreme storm to drift all night, did drive them by his providence to their desired port, beyond all their expectations. God drove them in to the Chesapeake Bay. In the morning, when the storm was over, they found there was the entrance. And the first thing they did was get off the ship, disembark, that's a fancy word, to get off the ship. And they got in their shallops and they went to the shore and they named the 2 pieces of land that stuck out for the king's sons, Cape Henry and Cape Charles. They went on to Cape Henry and they planted not an English flag in the sand, but a cross in the sand, thanking God praying that he would bless their efforts and dedicating the whole land of Virginia, which was most of America, quite frankly, dedicating all of that to God. They also prayed that they would raise up many generations of children. They specifically talked about the future and that there would be children who would have children who would have children. And you guys, that's us. They prayed for us that day at Cape Henry. All right, so you'll remember that you then took the mallet and everyone took a turn planting that cross right on the shores of Cape Henry when we were reenacting our trip outside in the driveway. So you guys also planted a cross in Mrs. Geirs's yard, but we were remembering what Reverend Robert Hunt did at Cape Henry. Now, the picture you see on your screen right now, the one on the left is just what we think it might have looked like there as they planted that cross. And then the one on the right is an actual stone monument that sits at Cape Henry today to help us remember what those first Virginia settlers did when they prayed, thanking God and dedicating the land to him. Now you remember we had to open up our box and we had to pull out our instructions. And we needed to see what exactly was on the instructions. Do y'all remember? Let's open them. On our instructions, it said, I need to make myself big real quick so you can read it. It said, go 50 miles. Okay, so their instructions were to not stay on the edge, to not stay on the coast. Why might that have been? Let's move me, oh, can't move me over. Let's make me little. There we go. So here they were at Cape Henry and Cape Charles, but why were they told to go into the Chesapeake and to go at least 50 miles? Well, because they weren't the only ships that were traveling up the coast of North America. In fact, the country that had the most ships coming up the coast of North America was Spain, bringing all of their treasure back from the New World. So we didn't want to be a sitting duck. We didn't want to be unprotected, sitting on the edge here of the land. Our instructions said to go 50 miles. So you remember you guys walked 50 steps to represent those 50 miles and wound up coming up a river. And you named that river after your king, the James River. And finally you came to a good spot and decided this was where you would build your settlement, right? And so we disembarked and we began to collect the things that we would need to build our settlement. And we did say that the James River right there is so deep, all the way to the edges of the bank, that those ships could actually tie up right at the edge of the river. That's unusual, you guys. Normally you have to go and anchor your boat in the middle where it's deep, and then it's shallow up at the edges. So you have to unload into the shallops, the little boats, and bring everything to the shore. But this was very unusual, and they thought this was going to help them to be in a good protected spot. The other thing they knew they would need, and they knew they would need it very quickly, they were attacked by Indians within a couple weeks, and they knew they would need a fort. So immediately they are building their houses, their storehouse, and their fort. The location they chose was also an island. And so again, they thought an island is a piece of land that's surrounded by water. And they thought that would be easier to protect. It would be harder for enemies to get to them if they were on an island. And of course, we talked about the fact that they were more than 50, about 53 miles they came inland before they found a really good spot to settle. All right, you guys, so then they went to work and we talked about how they constructed their fort. And this picture is a great illustration. All they had to build with were the things that were around them. So they had to go out into the woods and chop down trees, pretty good sized trees, cut them, sharpen points at the top, and then use that to build walls around their settlement. And we call those walls palisades. So the log posts were put together in a row, right, to form this fort. And what shape did they decide was best? A triangle. And Mrs. Gyrus described to you that a triangle allows you to fire your cannon. You see your cannon up here in these little parts called bulwarks. Bulwarks. These little half moons on each point of the triangle. But the triangle shape means that I can fire in many directions, and I can aim this way, and the other bulwark can aim this way. And I'm hard for me to show you, but you're creating something called crossfire. And it's very hard for enemies to get close to your fort if you are creating fire from your cannons this way and making it cross over. It's very dangerous for enemies that are trying to get to you. So they picked this triangle shape on purpose. That was not just, we thought it would be a fun design. They picked that on purpose. And the person that supervised all of this was the military leader, Captain John Smith. All right, triangle shape. These are those log posts that they were cutting in the woods. They would sink them down into a ditch about 4 feet deep. So first they had to dig the ditch. I'm going to go back so you can see. Here's the ditch that they were digging, and then it took lots of men to put those posts into place and build this palisade fence to protect themselves. So it was very hard work when they first arrived. It looks something like this, probably a little bit tighter together, but this is what the National Park Service has recreated for us there today. So we can see basically what it looked like when the Jamestown colonists built it. And you guys, we know exactly where those logs were today. We've uncovered the stains in the ground so we see the outline of the fort as a big stain in the ground. And so they came back and put those posts in exactly the same places where they were before. So that's really cool. When we go, if you go on this trip that we're talking about in the spring, you'll stand right there where the Jamestown colonists did. Now, not only did they need to build that palisade fence around their settlement, but of course they had to build homes. Those were some of the first things that they started on. But they only had the materials that were around them. So they used a technique that they had learned in England, and it's called wattle and daub. This is when we did our little craft together to make wattle and daub snacks, right? So the houses would look something like this. They would build a frame out of smaller trees that they cut down. So you can see those are slightly smaller than the palisade posts. So they would get these trees, build the frame, but then in order to build the walls of their home, they needed wattle and daub. So what is that? Well, the wattle are even smaller strips of wood that have been woven together almost like a basket. And then on top of that, once they have their framework all woven, then they daub a mud material up on top of it, kind of like stucco is today. In fact, this is a grown-up term, but if anybody in construction has heard of lathe and plaster, that's what we had just before drywall. So, just a few years ago, our walls were made of what's called lathe and plaster. And it really is a form of wattle and daub. So here on the left, you can clearly see the wattle part. That's that woven wooden framework. And then on the right, you can see all of the daub. And once it hardened up, it made a nice smooth surface, a nice insulated surface as well for their homes. So here on the left is the wattle, and there on the right, you can see the daub. And here again, wattle, and inside you see the daub on the back side, and then they're going to cover it again on this front side. So you kind of have the wattle is in the middle like a sandwich. And that's basically what we did with you. We had you put down the icing, which is the first layer of daub, and then you laid your pretzel sticks in as if that was your wattle, and then you coated it on the top with another layer of daub. So I hope you enjoyed your little wattle and daub snacks, and it helps us remember. I also mentioned to you in class that when they first got there, they did not have a big fancy church. Now they start building it pretty quickly, but it was going to be the biggest and nicest building within the fort. It was right in the middle, showing how important it was, right? But at first, when they arrived, Reverend Hunt had to conduct his services under the trees. And Captain John Smith told us, I read you a little quote from him. He told us that they cut a sail from one of the ships and they stretched it between 3 or 4 trees. And then they just cut down other trees to make a rail where they could take communion. And they cut stumps to use as seats. So just leftover tree stumps is what they lined up to be their chairs in their church. And that's how they had services. And today there's a special memorial. So I don't know if you're hearing a word memory when I say memorial. Memory. It's a place, a memorial is a little place, sometimes a big place, and it's built so that we have a memory. We remember something. And this memorial is for Reverend Robert Hunt. And on that memorial, there's a picture, and here it is, of what it would have looked like when he was having church services there when they first got there. And you can see the sail is stretched between the trees. You see this rail that they made where the people could come up and they could receive communion. They would take the cup and the bread from him right there at the front of their outdoor church. Now, within a year, they built a big, it still was kind of a simple church because it was just wattle and daub, you guys. But they built a church and Reverend Hunt began to conduct services in that church. But then he got very sick and died. So he lives only about 1 year at the Jamestown colony, but he made such a difference. I asked you what you remembered about him, and so there were a few things that were in the book, but then more things were in the little video clip from week 3. If you haven't watched it yet, you should watch it just to learn a little bit about him and his personality and how God used him to calm down the men in a really hard situation. Like they knew it was life and death, and there were Indians attacking them, and diseases were coming, and they weren't sure they would have enough food. And so that makes a lot of people want to fight and do wicked things. But he was reminding them constantly about why God had sent them there, and he was bringing peace to their fights. And they wrote about that. Again, Captain John Smith and others wrote about how important he was, and their very words are on that memorial to Reverend Robert Hunt. Again, if we go there in the spring, you're going to get to see it, and you can read those words for yourself and know that Reverend Robert Hunt walked right where you're standing. When he died, they gave him a great honor. They buried him. He was the first person to be buried inside their new church. And they buried him up at the front, right near the place where he would have preached to them. So they'd be reminded of him. So he was buried. It's called a chancel burial. That's a big fancy word, but inside the church at the front is called a chancel burial. He was the first person buried there. Were you guys? Only recently, just a couple decades ago now, they used to think they didn't know exactly where the fort was located. And as I said, today they found the whole outline of the fort. They know right where everything was. Not everything, but they're discovering things all the time. And just a few years ago, they figured out where that church was. And as they started to dig, they found the burial place of Reverend Robert Hunt. So now they've marked it, and I'll show you. So here's the outline of that church. You can see we were looking back here at this little wood structure a minute ago in our pictures. This is the James River behind you. And just inside the fort, they found the whole outline of the church. That's what this is. This is the church. And this cross that is closest to us, that's the burial place for Reverend Robert Hunt. And his bones are still there today. But you know what, you guys? There's going to come a day when he rises, right? When he is resurrected, when he comes right up to join Jesus. And so he waits there, or the bones wait there in anticipation. We know that he is with Jesus, but his bones are there. And next, I introduce to you A new character, unless you had already read the book. I think some of you read ahead, and that's okay. But we introduced this character, Captain John Smith. You've already been hearing his name because he's one of the key figures, one of the most important colonists to come. And he comes as the military leader. He has a few specific jobs that he's been given. He's on the list of people who will govern. They will make decisions for the colony. He's been asked to explore the area and to make maps, so he has special skills to be able to do that. They need good maps of Virginia, because remember, our first colony failed. We don't have any information from them. We want to know, what does the inland, the inside part, not just the coast, but what does it look like? How many rivers? How long are they? Where are the mountains? All of that. So his job is to map this whole area. And then protection. His job is to make sure that we're safe. So that's why he supervised the building of the fort and trained the men how to fire all the guns, right? Their firelock muskets and their cannon. So all those things were his responsibility. But I wanted to, in class, I talked to you a little bit about how did God get him ready, right? Because we understand that God prepares people for his special purpose. And so how did God prepare John Smith long before he was captain of anything? So from the time he was a little boy, he loved adventure. And he loved the idea, kind of like Richard Hakluyt, of exploring. And he was very outdoorsy. So he was different than Richard Hakluyt in that way. He was very intelligent and he loved to read books. So that was also like Richard Hakluyt. But the thing that was different was he was very physical. He liked to be in the woods. He liked to hunt and fish and sail. He loved to practice the skills that you need for war. One of those skills was jousting. So he would practice jousting. He had a horse and he would get on his horse and practice that long lance, or it kind of looks like a spear. He would practice aiming at targets and practice sword fighting and knife fighting and read books all about war. Well, that was not what his family had in mind for him. So he was from a town called Willoughby, and his family had quite a lot of land. They were farmers. And so he was supposed to grow up and be a farmer. Well, it became clear that he did not want to be a farmer. And then his father died. So John Smith had a hard thing happen in his life as well. His mom got married again, and they saw he didn't want to be a farmer, but his father thought that, or his stepfather thought that he should be a merchant, that would be a good choice. But being a merchant and training for a merchant position, that's called being an apprentice. So he was being an apprentice for a merchant. And that meant that you sat on a stool and you took lots of notes and you wrote things in books and you weren't very active. You didn't get to get up and move and do a lot of things, at least his job. And he found that he was not very well fitted for that. And he actually paid to get out of that and to go do his own thing. And you guys, when he was just 16 years old, he left England and he went off to fight in a war that was going on in the Netherlands over on the continent of Europe. But he pretty quickly found out that he was on the wrong side. He thought, I don't fit. He volunteered to do it, but it didn't turn out too well. And so he came back home. Well, when he came back home, again, he didn't want to be a farmer, and he got permission to simply live out in the woods and try to support himself. Just live off the land. And so, I'm going to make myself small. He did that for quite some time. This was when he was about 19 or 20 years old. He lived in the woods. He talks about building a leafy bower. Now, that's a funny word. It just means a tree house. He built himself a tree house, and he lived in it for a good long time. And he spent his time hunting for food, practicing all of his war skills, jousting, sword play, even firing guns. He had a pistol, and he had books, and he read every book about war that he could find. Y'all, he was getting ready. Now, this was very unusual, but God had set him apart for a special purpose, and he was using this time to get Captain John Smith ready. Well, when he was about 21, he traveled and became part of a new war. And this war was Christian armies in Hungary. That's a nation I have not shown you on the map of Europe. But in Hungary, they were facing an enemy, and that enemy were the Muslim Turks. And they believe something entirely different. They are not Christians, and they wanted to defeat the Christians entirely. And so there was a big fight in Hungary. And Captain John Smith, who loved God's word and wanted to protect Christianity, said, I want to go be part of that fight. And so he did. And you guys, when he first got there, there was a particular place that he went, and the Muslim Turks had surrounded the Christian army. The Christian army was inside a castle, and they were stuck because all around them were the enemy. So now he was part of the rescue team that came. When they got there, they needed to get messages. Somehow they needed to tell the Christian army who was stuck inside this castle that we're here, and give them the plan for how they were going to rescue them. Everybody was discussing how we should do this. And young John Smith, who was just a nobody then, he had just volunteered, he was just part of the team, but he raised his hand and said, I have an idea. I read about it in my war books. We can use flags that we light on fire, kind of like when you take a sparkler and you write. He said, we can use fiery flags to send a message. They already had these codes that they used. And he said, that's how we can communicate, is if we light these flags on fire, and if we use a special material, they'll stay lit for a long time, and we can actually use them to kind of write our code in the sky or in the air. That's what they did. And it worked. And the Christian army was rescued. And John Smith became a hero. And so his commanding officer said, I'm going to make you a captain. From now on, you'll be called Captain John Smith, and you'll be in charge of about 40 other men. You guys, he was brand new. But already, all of that preparation that God had built into him was bearing fruit. He was being given additional responsibilities and more opportunities. Along the way, you can read all about his adventures in the war. He had many other wonderful ideas that helped them win, things that he had learned about during his time in his treehouse, in his leafy bower. God was getting him ready for what was to come. Towards the end of the war, there was another event. And this time, it was the Muslim Turks who had been surrounded. So the Christian army was all around them, but they wouldn't give up. And one day, they decided that they would send out a challenger. And this was something that they did sometimes back then. They would say, in order to save some lives so that everybody doesn't have to fight, we'll send out our best guy and you send out your best guy. And we'll let them fight, and whoever wins, the other side will surrender. So they sent out a fierce warrior called Turbashaw, and he was known for being a very violent fighter, and he had a very fancy helmet with eagle feathers all over it. They sent him out. Well, guess who raised his hand to say, I'll fight? Yes, it was Captain John Smith. I'm going to read to you. I'm reading from this book, Captain John Smith, A Foothold in the New World by Janet and Jeff Bangi. So this is a good one, and I'm going to read to you what happened here in Hungary when Turbashaw showed up. At the appointed time, Turbashaw emerged from behind the fortified wall of Orasti with great fanfare, a parade of servants bearing his armor and his weapons. When Turbashaw had finally put on his armor and mounted his horse, John rode out from behind army lines, his lance, that's his big, long kind of spear, tucked under one arm and his helmet tucked under the other. The two combatants rode up to each other and bowed. They then rode out 75 paces in opposite directions. John put on his helmet, tightened the straps on the side of his armor, wrapped his arm around his lance, and held up the lance, ready to charge. When a pistol sounded, he dug his heels into the side of his horse, and the animal broke into an immediate gallop. As John and Turbashaw raced at each other, John saw the weakness in his opponent's armor. A small gap between the top of Turbashaw's breastplate and his helmet. John stretched out his arm and aimed his lance at the gap. And as the two horses swooped by each other, John's lance found its mark, sending Turbishaw hurtling backwards off his horse to the ground. By the time John had dismounted and walked over to his opponent, Turbishaw was dead. John took his sword and removed his head. He wanted an end. That's what you were supposed to do, much like David and Goliath. That's exactly what David did to Goliath. He wanted an end to all of this fighting, and this would surely end it, right? It did not. One of Turbishaw's friends, a man named Grualgo, was so angry that John had killed his friend, he immediately challenged John to a duel the next day. John accepted, and the following afternoon he once again rode out to do battle. This time the men had agreed to arm themselves with lances and swords and pistols. Once again, John galloped at his opponent with his lance out, but this time he was unable to penetrate Grualgo's armor or knock him off his horse. So the two men reeled their horses for another charge. By the time John had turned his horse and gotten it up again to a gallop, Grualgo had already thrown away his lance and taken out his pistol. He fired at John, who jerked his horse to the left. The bullet from the pistol hit John's armor with a glancing blow, denting it, but not harming John. But now it was John's turn. He grabbed his pistol, aimed it, and fired it. The bullet penetrated Grualgo's shoulder right where his breastplate and the armor on his arm came together. Grualgo fell to the ground, injured. In an instant, John was standing beside him. He drew his sword and struck Grualgo before he could fight back. And then he cut his head off as well. Once again, John rode back to his army victorious. 2 days later, it was John who issued a challenge to the Turks, who had still not given up. He said, "Fine, send out your best officer." Well, a man by the name of Buonamolgre, or Bonnie Mulgrew, as John called him, accepted the challenge. This time the men agreed to fight with battle axes, pistols, and swords. Again on horseback, they galloped toward each other. They drew their pistols and fired. Each man missed the other one. They turned their horses and charged again, this time using their battle axes. Back and forth the two went, combating each other with their vicious battle axes. They managed to dent each other's armor, but neither man had the advantage, that is, until Bonnie Mulgrew managed to strike John on the side of his helmet with his battle axe, and the force sent John sideways. His foot slipped out of the stirrup. He didn't fall completely from his horse, but while John struggled to get his balance back, Bonnie Mulgrew moved in for the kill. A huge cheer went up from the Turks watching the duel from the walls of Orasti. As Bonnie Mulgrew raised his battle axe to deliver a final blow, John saw his weak point, a small gap in his armor. In a single move, while still off balance, John grabbed the handle of his sword, pulled it from its scabbard, and struck his opponent at his weak point. Bonnie Mulgrew crumpled to the ground. I will read to you what John Smith wrote about this at this point. He says, he had actually been knocked to the ground, so I think that this book has a little bit wrong, where they still, I think, have him on his horse, but they were actually wrestling at that point. They had been knocked to the ground. Both men were wrestling when he was hit in the head with the battle axe, and he said he was lost his orientation and couldn't tell, what was happening. And then just as Bonnie Mulgrew went in for the kill, he says, "Beyond all men's expectations, and by God's assistance, I dodged the next blow, and I stabbed the Turk in the back. Mulgrew fell, and Smith said he lost his head as the rest had done." Well, you all, he now was a hero of this battle. The Turks finally surrendered, and Captain John Smith became the famous hero of the battle at Orasti. And what this entitled him to was a coat of arms. Now, in England, people had a coat of arms because of what family they were born into, and they just passed it down. And if you were a common person, you didn't have a coat of arms. But here, he was given a coat of arms because of the great deed that he had done, this great victory that he had accomplished. And so we took a look at his coat of arms. This is a picture of what jousting looks like. This was what Captain John Smith would have been practicing out in the woods when God was preparing him for the great battle against Turbashaw and Grualgo and Bonnie Mulgrew. This is what he would have looked like as a soldier. This is what English soldiers looked like at the time. And here he is. Here's his image, Captain John Smith. And here is the coat of arms that he was given because of his great victory. And we did a little coloring sheet. Let's see, put it to the side. It looks like I don't have mine out, but you see it there on the screen. And we noticed that on the coat of arms that it has 3 turbaned heads. You see that hat that those men are wearing? That's the same type of hat that the Turkish soldiers would have worn under their helmet. So that represents 3 Turks, all killed by Captain John Smith, because that was his claim to fame. And then we notice some of the other things we see, like the colors, the things that Mrs. Gyrus taught us about heraldry. The green represented hope and joy, that's the kind of man that he was, right? Very hopeful, very courageous, very into battle with joy, a joyful warrior. And then the colors of red and white all around his helmet. I'll show you. Here's the helmet. So this represents his military abilities. The red is bravery and courage, and the white is purity and honesty. That's the kind of man he was. And then up at the top, that's kind of weird, right? Well, it wasn't weird at the time. An ostrich is considered to be a very wise bird. An ostrich is watchful. It's always paying attention to things. So you can't trick an ostrich very easily. They're also very strong birds. They can hurt you. And at the time, the reason he's holding this little horseshoe in his mouth is because people thought that they could eat iron, that they were so tough they could actually eat metal and be okay. So we colored our version of the Captain John Smith coat of arms and the crest up here. The crest is the ostrich part. Now, I'm going to put this on your class website. So if you guys want to color it again, or maybe one of your brothers or sisters would like to, your moms can print that out and you can color it again. We also talked a little bit about Captain John Smith and his other adventures. We've already said, he's the guy responsible for protecting the colony, but we mentioned he was supposed to explore. So you guys, he did begin to explore. In December, after they arrived in May, he started to explore. And in December, he was actually with a group of men, a small group of men, when suddenly out of the woods came the local Indians, and they were able to capture him. They killed all the other men, but the thing that saved him was his beautiful coat of armor. His coat of armor, not coat of arms, his beautiful suit of armor, I should say. This shiny suit of armor. It was very clear that his was nicer and better than everybody else's, and they had an Indian guide with them who was pointing to him as the leader. So they took him captive. They decided, let's bring him to our big chief. That chief's name, his actual name, was Wahun Sanaka. You may say that. Wahun Sanaka. But people today know him as Chief Powhatan because he was chief of the Powhatan Nation. The Powhatan Nation had lots of small tribes in it that he had conquered, and he was controlling them. So they didn't necessarily want to be part of the Powhatan Confederacy, but this chief, Wahun Sanaka, very powerful, was in charge. So this group of Indians that captured him, one of them was Wahun Sanaka's brother. And he said, I'm going to bring this guy to my brother, and he'll want to see him and maybe find out things from him. Well, sure enough, they did. And not only that, but Wahun Sanaka, or Chief Powhatan, wanted to show him off. He wanted to take John Smith all over the Powhatan Confederacy. Y'all, it was huge. This was thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, so a lot of modern-day Virginia. And so he took him on trips, and he was showing off and saying, these Englishmen have come, and we've never seen anything like this, right? It's almost like space aliens arrived, and some people were very afraid of them. But he wanted to show, don't be afraid of them. I have conquered him. Well, while he was showing off Captain John Smith by taking him to all of the Indian villages, what do we know about that ostrich on his crest? Ostriches are very watchful. So was Captain John Smith. He was noticing how vulnerable, how strong these Indian tribes were or not, noticing where they were located, paying attention to rivers and where they were taking them and how they were taking them and how they fought and supplies that they had. And he was scouting the whole time, not knowing if he'd be able to use that information. Well, when he got back to where Wacomico, it's called. So where Wacomico was kind of the capital city, where Wahun Seneca had his village. Well, when he finally got back there, they feasted him. They had this great big feast. He didn't know what to think. He thought maybe they were getting him fattened up to eat him. He just wasn't sure. Then he wrote that after they had had this great feast, that suddenly the chief ordered him to be brought to a big flat stone and for his head to be laid on the stone, and two great braves came, big men with clubs, and that he ordered them to beat his brains out. But that just at that moment, a young girl just 12 years old came and took his head in her hands and said, "No, no, stop." And she pleaded for his life. And that young girl was Pocahontas. And it was the chief's own dear daughter who pleaded for Captain John Smith's life. Well, the chief agreed. And he said, "Now, we have no choice. You will be my friend. But I want you," he said, "to work with me. We will help you, and I will expect you to help us." And he sent Captain John Smith back to the fort. Well, that was our first introduction. That's the first time that Captain John Smith met Pocahontas. They will become good friends. But you guys, in the Disney movie, they make it seem like they're in love with each other. No, no, no. Don't learn history from Disney. They were not. Captain John Smith was 28 years old when this happened, and Pocahontas was 12. They were not interested in one another at all, romantically, but she will prove to be a helper to the colony. In fact, later Captain John Smith writes about her and says, if not for the help of Pocahontas, who was the instrument of God, our colony would never have survived. So he continues to see God's providence, right? His care and control over all of his creation, even in Pocahontas. Because look, was Captain John Smith just lucky? Was it a coincidence that Pocahontas was there? Was he lucky that she saved his life? Boy, he was lucky. No, no. We know that God is in control of all of his creation, and he was working this out as part of his plan. Well, we did also briefly talk about the fact that Captain John Smith, after this, did gather a whole group of men, and they boarded up in small ships like shallops, and they went out to explore this land that had been named after their queen, Virginia, right? So off they went to explore, and this was the map that he created. I'm going to show you a big one. So I have one of the maps that's an actual size, and I will bring it with me next week so that you can see it. So this is wonderful because you can really get up close to it and see all the incredible details that Captain John Smith included. Let me go small again real quick. So you can see here, if you're looking at it, you see that he's putting in the types of trees that they're encountering. He puts these wonderful pictures of the native peoples that he met, what kind of clothing they had. Even up here, look, you guys, he included a picture of what their houses looked like. The only reason we know what the local tribes' huts looked like was because the English people made pictures of them and put them in maps, right? But the other thing I mentioned to you that you were going to do for homework was I sent home with you a map that looks like this, small version. And I said, that on this map, Captain John Smith uses a special symbol. It's called a Maltese cross. And he uses that Maltese cross to mark all the places where he actually went. So here's what a Maltese cross looks like. Look down here at this compass rose. Remember, a compass rose tells us directions: north, south, east, and west. But on old maps, you guys, on our maps today, we look at a map and it's always north at the top. That's not how they used to draw them. They drew the map from however their ship sailed in. So the ship sailed in kind of from the bottom part. That's where the Atlantic Ocean is out here. Do you notice they call it the Virginian Sea? They sailed in. Here's the ship sailing in. So they drew the map from the way that they came in to the land. So now, which way is actually north? We have to look at this compass rose, and we find this fancy yellow fleur-de-lis. That's what tells us north is actually up this way. Okay? It's pointing north. But down here, pointing to the west, is a Maltese cross, sometimes called a Jerusalem cross. It's pointing towards Jerusalem. Okay? That was very important to explorers like Captain John Smith, who were pointing to that Christian heritage back in Jerusalem. So the Maltese cross he had taken as a symbol for himself. It was a symbol of a Christian warrior at the time. So he takes little Maltese crosses. They were made out of brass, and he took a whole bunch with him on this trip. And they would travel into the Chesapeake Bay, and they would explore a river. And so, guys, if you take your finger and you trace down a river and keep going down the river until you see a Maltese cross right here. I know it's tiny on the screen, but there it is. He would actually get out of the boat, and as they explored, he would make notes, and he's measured that river and drawn it and all that. But then he would hammer one of those brass crosses into a tree, and that meant, I've actually come this far. But anything else that's on my map, because you notice there's more drawings out here. So he's drawn some mountains, and he tells a tribe that lives out here, and he drew some more mountains and villages. He hasn't actually seen those with his own eyes. So the stuff that's before that, he has seen. But anything that's past the crosses, he's just heard about. Somebody's told him that there was another village and that they're called the Monacans, and that's why he put them on the map. Okay? So your homework is to trace all these rivers. Guys, he traveled the whole Chesapeake Bay. So you're to take your little finger and look closely and see what you can find. There are 27 of those Maltese crosses on the map. So let's see if you can find 20, just even 20. Let's see if you can find 20 of those Maltese crosses. And remember this wonderful contribution that Captain John Smith gave us. And you guys, this was really important. We had no other map of Virginia at that time. So he produces this, and it's printed back in England on a printing press, right? Because of his contributions, Captain John Smith is called the father of Virginia. Now, you guys, he's only there a little over, well, about a year and a half, 1607, May of 1607 to October of 1609. And he serves as the governor. One of the rules that he made, I know you'll remember it. Some of the men were being lazy, and he knew we can't make it unless everybody works. So he took a page right out of the Bible that says if a man does not work, he shall not eat. Well, that changed a lot of things. There in Jamestown, when we go, you're going to see this statue celebrating the contributions of Captain John Smith. All of the things that God prepared him for and that he did were what established this colony. If not for Captain John Smith, it never would have survived. And if you look closely at that statue, you'll see that it has his coat of arms and his crest right on it. And you should be able to identify what? 3 turbaned heads. There's the ostrich at the top, and at the bottom are those Latin words, vincere est vivere. And that means to conquer is to live. God had prepared a man who was designed for war. He was made for battle. And from the time he was a little guy, God was getting him ready for this very special purpose. God prepares individuals for his purpose. He gets them ready. Jeremiah 1:5 says, you say it with me, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. That means I set you apart for a special purpose. So this week you're going to be reading the rest of your book, Odyssey of Faith, and you're going to meet Pocahontas, another fascinating person that God is preparing for his very special purpose. Before he formed her in the womb, he knew her. Before she was born, he consecrated her, set her apart for a very special purpose. I hope you guys have fun this week discovering more characters in the story of Jamestown and uncovering how God used Pocahontas especially for his special purpose.